Now, before Father Hidalgo called for independence in 1810, there were some events that were going on back in Europe, in Spain, that were also going to contribute to the rise of this independence movement. So let's talk about that. For one, back in Europe, there was a lot of warfare going on. This is the time period of the Napoleonic Wars. And yes, we're talking about Napoleon of France. Napoleon and his French army were in a period of expansion, right? They were expanding the French Empire there in continental Europe at this time. And so Napoleon was going to war with a number of different European states all at the same time. Okay, and they were winning at this point. And so one of the areas that Napoleon invaded was Spain. Yes, he invaded the Iberian Peninsula. And the king of Spain at that time was King Ferdinand VII. And so Ferdinand was not captured. He was able to flee from Spain before Napoleon's forces could capture him. But Napoleon and his forces were able to take over Spain when King Ferdinand VII left the country. Okay, and so he was deposed. He was no longer ruling Spain. This happens in 1808. And so in this year, 1808, Napoleon is going to install his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain, because King Ferdinand VII had to leave the country or else he would have been captured by Napoleon. All right, and so now technically Joseph Bonaparte is the king of Spain, the brother of Napoleon. But not all Spanish officials accepted Joseph Bonaparte as their king. Instead, they fled to the region of Cadiz and they set up a congress there, or a Cortes, okay? And so in Cadiz, which is an area that Napoleon hadn't conquered yet, we see the formation of this political congress, or the Cortes, is known as the Cortes of Cadiz, right? Or the Cortes de Cadiz. And so this Congress was resisting the leadership of Joseph Bonaparte, and they were still attempting to run the empire, okay? Even though King Ferdinand VII was no longer there in the country. And so the Cortes is actually going to create a constitution in 1812. And so this is different because before this, Spain was an absolute monarchy. All right, they didn't have a Congress, they didn't have a parliament, they didn't have a constitution. And this was a period of time where you're having revolutions taking place, such as in the United States and in France. And so there's this movement that is happening in different parts of the world, right? Such as in the United States and in Europe, where countries are having revolutions and they're breaking away from monarchy. Okay, so in the U.S., the revolution breaks away from the British Empire, so the United States becomes independent from the British Empire, no longer ruled by the British king. Right? In France, very similar. You have a revolution take place, and the king is actually executed. All right, and so there's a larger movement going on here where the people are trying to claim more political power. Right? Even if it's not a complete revolution, you're starting to see the establishment of more constitutional monarchies in Europe. Okay, and a constitutional monarchy is basically where you don't have the absolute rule of a king, right, where the king can do whatever he wants. You have the creation of a parliament, okay, and the writing of a constitution. And inside that constitution, you're going to have guarantees of specific rights for the people of that country. Okay, very different from having an absolute monarchy where the king could do whatever he wants. He could throw anyone in jail whenever he wants. Your rights are not written down in an actual document, okay, and guaranteed in that country. So you're starting to see this movement where countries are moving towards constitutional monarchies or towards being republics where there is no king. Now, in Spain, with the Cortes of Cadiz, they're not trying to overthrow the king. Right? They still recognize the king, Ferdinand VII, as being their king, but they are creating a constitutional monarchy. They're writing up a constitution which is guaranteeing certain rights for Spain and its colonies. And they're creating a parliament. The Cortes is the parliament. Okay? They're creating a parliament now which has legislative authority. So the Constitution of 1812 is kind of limiting the powers that the king had beforehand. Right? And the king's not even there in the country to stop it at this time in 1812, right? And so that's why the Congress is able to create this constitution in the first place, okay? So now you have a Congress in Spain, you have a parliament. And so who is going to be part of this parliament, right? How do you choose members of the parliament? Well, you vote them in. So the Constitution of 1812 is actually going to extend the right to vote to all free males in the Spanish Empire. So they can vote for members of parliament, right? So they can vote for who is going to represent them in parliament. So this is a major change. Before this, the king had absolute power. Right? He had ministers that worked for him, right? Not like religious ministers, but government officials who worked for him. And whatever he said basically would become law. But now you have the creation of a parliament where representatives are voted into parliament, and now they could go and they could discuss and they could debate and they could come up with legislation and they could create laws that way. Or at least they could act as an advisory board for the king, right? And these are elected officials, elected representatives. So that's a major change in government, and the whole reason why it happens is because the government is so unstable because of the invasion of Napoleon and his army. Right? And the installation of Joseph Bonaparte. So the Constitution of 1812 is going to make some major political changes in Spain. And also, the Constitution is going to allow the colonies to send representatives to the Cortes as well, to the Congress, to the Parliament. And so this is a major change for the colonies. Before this, the colonies weren't sending representatives to Spain to represent their interests. No, before that, they just had to do whatever the viceroy said or whatever the king said, right? But now they're able to elect officials who could represent their interests, and these officials could go to Spain and they could take part in the Congress, which met every year. All right, and so these are major changes that were going on in the government of Spain during this time. Now, eventually, Napoleon's forces are going to be pushed out of Spain. King Ferdinand VII is going to return, and then he is going to be facing this new constitution, which is limiting his power and giving some political power to these elected officials, to the Cortes, right, to the Congress. And so when Ferdinand returns and he retakes the throne of Spain in 1814, one of the first things that he's going to do is void the Constitution of 1812, right? He doesn't want to share his political power with the Cortes, right? With this parliament. He doesn't want to have to work with them. He wants to just run the country with the same authority that he had before Napoleon invaded Spain. And so he completely voids the Constitution of 1812. Now, this is going to lead to a number of revolutionary movements in the Spanish colonies in the Americas, not just in Mexico, right, with Hidalgo, but in a number of other colonies, such as in South America as well. Part of the reason for this is because the Constitution of 1812 gave more political power to the colonies. Right? And so for liberal-minded individuals in the colonies, they totally supported the Constitution of 1812. So when Ferdinand VII voids the Constitution, this is a problem. Right? They wanted to have more political power. They wanted to have representatives being sent to the Congress. And so you have a number of revolutions going on in the early 1800s, and Ferdinand VII is going to put together a military force, send them to the colonies to try to stop these revolutions. The problem was his military force, the Spanish army, was not able to defeat the revolutionary forces in the colonies. And ultimately, Ferdinand VII was forced to reinstate the Constitution of 1812. All right, so he does this in 1820 because he wants to bring some stability back to the colonies. He's hoping that this will stop the revolutions in the colonies. But it didn't work, right? Just because Ferdinand reinstituted the Constitution of 1812, the revolutions continued in the colonies, right? And he is actually going to upset the conservatives. Yeah, because liberals, they liked the Constitution of 1812. They were happy that he reinstated it, right? Because they wanted more political representation in the Cortes. They wanted to have a Cortes in the first place, right? They wanted to have a parliament because they wanted more of a say-so in politics. Right? But conservatives, on the other hand, were not so happy about the Constitution of 1812. Why? Because the Constitution of 1812 took away a number of privileges from the nobility, right, the upper class. And so with the loss of these privileges, you have a number of conservatives upset with Ferdinand VII because he reinstated the Constitution. And so now the conservatives are starting to consider the idea of revolution, right? To gain independence from the Spanish Empire. Now, the revolution never really stopped in Mexico, right? Even though Hidalgo was executed, like I said earlier, you still have a number of different resistance movements, guerrilla armies fighting in different parts of the country.